Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, where we'll be discussing the EU and the global outlook for COVID-19. My name is Jim Saxon. I'm a congressional reporter at CQ Roll Call, which is part of the FiscalNote family. Both FiscalNote and CQ Roll Call are actively monitoring the coronavirus outbreak and the effects it is having on both our politics and policy. To see the most up-to-date and comprehensive monitoring of the virus and how governments in the US and the EU are responding, visit coronavirus.fiscalnote.com. Also, be sure to sign up for complimentary access to EU policy updates on COVID-19 at fnlink.co/EU dossiers. We've made a lot of our coverage available there free of charge to help you navigate through this crisis. You can also sign up for our daily newsletter and learn more about how FiscalNote can help your organization monitor the politics and policy around COVID-19. I've got just a few housekeeping items before we start. You'll see a Q&A box and a chat box on your screen. You can use them to submit questions during the webinar. Feel free to submit your questions at any time. We'll try to get to everyone. Also, after this webinar is done, we'll send out a recording. Everyone should be muted on entry, but if you're not, with the exception of our panelists, please make sure your microphone is on mute now. So today I'm joined by two industry experts who will help guide the conversation and will be able to answer your questions. Susan Danger is the CEO of the American Chamber of Commerce to the EU, which speaks for American companies committed to Europe on trade, investment, and competitiveness issues. Susan also serves as the chair for the American Chambers in Europe, the umbrella organization for the 45 American Chambers of Commerce from 43 countries throughout Europe and Eurasia. Tom Adlam is the senior policy analyst with FiscalNote's Professional Services. Tom is currently tasked with leading the team collecting and collating the data on Europe's response to COVID-19. Before we get started with Tom and Susan's opening remarks, I wanted to set the stage a little bit. The coronavirus is a 100-year plague that has upended daily life all over the world. As of last night, there are 1.5 million active cases and more than 88,000 dead. To slow the contagion spread, governments have imposed strict social distancing rules. These effectively put entire sectors of the economy into a medically induced coma. Whether or not these businesses will be able to wake up and recover depends heavily on how our governments respond. In the US, you are probably familiar that Congress has passed a $2.3 trillion rescue package to keep business and companies afloat. There are direct checks, small business relief through forgivable loans, and the Fed is right now, as we speak, setting up multi-billion-dollar lending facilities to get more liquidity out to the companies. Today's talk is about, though, is what is happening in Europe, and that's why we have Susan and Tom today. I'm personally very curious to hear how some of the responses there are going. A lot of the countries have taken more aggressive efforts to put money directly into the bank accounts of their citizens and to support small, all size businesses to maintain their payrolls. Whereas the American response so far has been to rely heavily on our existing unemployment insurance system. So it'll be really interesting to hear what Tom and Susan have to say, I think. Susan, why don't we start with you?
So thank you, Jim. Thank you, everybody. Thanks, FiscalNote. I'd like to thank you for the invitation, and great to be with you virtually from Brussels, where I'm sitting on a very sunny afternoon here on this side of the Atlantic. Thanks to FiscalNote, our team here makes great use of your issue tracker and have a fantastic relationship with Arnaud here in Brussels. So as you said about AmChamEU, but maybe just to emphasize, AmChamEU represents over 155 US companies. That's companies from a wide range of sectors, and as you said, they are completely committed to and invested in Europe, with many having been here for over 100 years. And I think important for everyone on the call who understand, and mostly on the US side of the Atlantic, is to understand our objectives. One is to build a strong and united EU, and without a strong single market. We're totally focused on the European project. And the second one is maintaining and strengthening the transatlantic relationship. And I think both of these have a lot to do with what we're going to talk about today. As you said, my second hat is also that I'm chair of this network of 45 AmChams in 43 countries in Europe and Eurasia. But let's turn to COVID-19. It's absolutely without doubt, certainly on this side, that this global pandemic is going to have profound social and economic implications, and it already is. From this side over here, our companies are doing their utmost to support governments in their efforts to manage the crisis, such as, what they're concerned about is shutdown, supply chains breaking up. And these are some of the challenges that they're facing, staff shortages. So all these new challenges as they strive to adapt to these current circumstances. And during this time, we believe clarity and coordination is absolutely essential to minimize disruption and to allow for the quickest recovery possible. So as we face this most significant public health and economic challenge in at least a generation, strong cooperation between government, between business and civil society is going to be absolutely essential during this phase to find common solutions to these shared challenges. No one can do this alone. So as AmChamEU, we welcome the bold policy measures already taken by governments, but we need to continue to ensure that there is a coordinated response at EU level. I would, however, like to recognise there's a lot in the press about this at the moment, often a lot of it negative, but I would like to recognise the European Commission's efforts to act very quickly and to coordinate many actions across the member states. And recognising, and some of you may not be aware of this, of course, they have the added challenge here of communicating in multiple languages to citizens. That's one of the many challenges, and this is not easy. It's not that straightforward. So we commend them for what they've done so far. So how about business? AmChamEU has done some very practical steps in contributing to address the current crisis on a very practical level, and I invite you all to look at that. We launched a portal on our AmChamEU website, which is a source of information for all stakeholders, and it covers the EU response, it covers business response, and importantly, it covers the initiative that our US member companies have taken to support governments in their efforts to manage the outbreak. For example, just one that we have up there is a joint initiative by 3M, GE, and Ford. We're all working together to produce medical equipment now, including respirators, ventilators, and 3D face shields. And another one is Raytheon, who have made a commitment to provide 19,000 masks, 75,000 pairs of gloves, and 3,000 medical suits. Now, these are just two examples, but there are countless others of how all types of industry are playing its part. And in addition, I think very importantly, because this is what our US companies need, is they need to know what's happening at member state level, and they're requiring more coordination than ever before there. So through the AmChams in Europe network, which is this umbrella network, we are liaising very regularly, sharing information, and just this week came out with a statement signed by all 45 countries calling for solidarity, coordination and action, and I invite you to look at that. So now moving on to, let me tell you what we are saying with regard to economic recovery. We spoke out initially with regard to customs, border management and border flows was the first challenge that came up for our companies. It's absolutely essential that these stay as open as possible. So the three principles that we're speaking out for now with regard to economic recovery are threefold. So the first one is the single market has to be at the heart of Europe's economic recovery. The single market is probably this term on the US side that you've heard about. It's often highly criticized. US companies like the single market. It brings tremendous benefits to citizens and businesses, free flow of goods, of services, of people. It's absolutely essential for goods, services, capital and people to move freely across the EU, and particularly at this time of crisis. And for this reason, it's turned Europe into one of the most attractive destinations for international investment. But this market's going to be clearly under pressure given the new measures coming into place to contain the outbreak. But it's absolutely crucial to avoid any long-term protectionist measures. We have to recognise the key role of the single market in the European integration process. It has to be at the core of economic recovery. Secondly, trade and investment is the fuel for the global economic engine. Trade brings huge benefits to consumers and businesses everywhere around the world. The EU is the world's largest trading bloc, the largest exporter of goods and services. During a sudden economic crisis like this one, it is absolutely essential that all governments avoid this temptation to turn towards protectionism, and we are seeing that at the moment. We're trying to avoid it. So instead of trying to inhibit how goods move globally, the US and Europe must be partnering to facilitate trade, and especially for those goods and services that are going to help treat COVID-19 and encourage its economic recovery. I mean, to give you just a couple of figures, to recognize this, and despite the current political turbulence, which we do have aside of the crisis, the transatlantic economy generates $5.6 trillion in total commercial sales a year and employs up to 16 million workers in mutually onshored jobs. It's the largest and wealthiest market in the world, and it counts for close to 1/3 of world GDP in purchasing power. So trade investment plays a key role. And finally, the third piece is international cooperation to find a common solution. We believe that the world's most pressing issues, including this one we have today, can only be addressed through global cooperation. We believe the entire global community should ensure a coordinated approach to the health emergency caused by COVID-19 and the ripple effects that we're all seeing on the economy. This transatlantic partnership is more critical than ever before. We're friends and allies. We need the EU and the US to work together with the global community. And for that, we believe we can count on this long-lasting relationship, which is underpinned by our common history and values. And on that note, I leave it there, Jim. I hope that's set the scene a little bit from my side in terms of the business reaction, and I look forward to the Q&A. Thank you.
Thanks, Susan. That was great. Tom, let's kick it over to you.
Yeah, hello everyone. Good afternoon or good morning if you're in America. So I'm Tom Adlam and I'm the senior analyst in FN's EU office. And we've been working quickly to kind of gather and collate different national responses alongside unusual EU-focused, EU-IT-focused coverage. And my opening remarks will be on the EU reaction to the crisis and the EU's next steps before hopefully in the Q&A we can really get into kind of member state nitty-gritty. I'm going to begin with the headline-grabbing poll last month. I read this in South African news, it popped up in Japan, it popped up in America, and that is apparently 88% of Italians believe the EU has not done enough for them, and a majority now see membership as a disadvantage. The same company in November polled a firm majority in favor of EU membership. But what does this sentiment actually mean, and what has the EU been up to? Firstly, I think it's important to reiterate, the EU is not a country. What it can and cannot do is closely controlled by treaty and procedure. Member states, as a rule, do not give the Commission powers that are not explicitly necessary. And even now, many are wary of the Commission using this crisis for a power grab. So what this means practically is that when the EU is hit with a crisis that requires rapid response, we are often caught flat-footed. So recent examples being, 2007, sovereign debt crisis, and then the 2015 migrant crisis. In both these cases, Europe was criticized for being initially invisible or inactive, and just not responding as quickly as people wanted them to. But this is because they do not have the powers within the treaty and procedures to do this. So while the EU response has been criticized in some corners, I would agree with Susan and say they have done a lot with what they can do. And I can go into some of these measures here. So practically, there's a lot going on. Health coordination, reducing state aid rules, ensuring movement of critical goods, creating frameworks for the sharing of data and digital monitoring, to name but a few. So on the health front, the Commission-led Health Committee is coordinating cross-border transfers of medical personnel. So when you have examples of Italian patients being airlifted into German hospitals or French sick being ferried on trains to Luxembourg ICUs, that is coordinated by the Commission-led Health Committee. The structures that are allowing this to happen, that are allowing insurance to be waived, that is coming from a set of guidelines put forward and organized by the Commission. So while this has been quite technical and behind the scenes, this is often where the EU is most effective and they're getting stuff done. economically, the significant relaxing of state aid rules is massive. It allows governments as diverse as the UK, Poland, Netherlands, Spain, to radically intervene in their economies and to do what's necessary. So we can go into what they've actually done later. And then, as Susan mentioned, they facilitated the continued movement of critical goods across borders. So when you see Estonians trapped at the Polish border or French police impounding desperately needed medical equipment that's bound for the UK and Calais, the Commission is working and actually has succeeded in the creation of these green lanes to stop that kind of stuff happening, to ensure that goods are moving. It was initial member state overreaction that threatened to shut it down. It's the EU Commission and the EU institutions that are working to open that back up. And then the digital toolkit. So I know in America, you're all very aware with GDPR and the European approach to privacy. And how does this work in a health crisis? Well, the EU's produced a toolkit that allows the use of mobile applications and mobile data across borders, but also protects a hard-won European ideal of privacy. So this is where the Commission can be very active in creating guidelines and creating toolkits and allowing and facilitating the movement of ideas and people. So, and there's a load of other small measures that we can go into later, but we've also mobilized the remaining 2020 EU funds for the COVID crisis. And then what next in the short term? So the Commission's actually trying to do a lot and is advocating for a lot. They proposed a 100 billion support for unemployment, or SURE, which is a fund for member states to support workers, not for companies. So this is an instant red flag for some member states. Is this a step towards an EU safety net? No, that's what some people are worried about. The Commission has already proposed doubling the next EU budget up to about 2% of GDP of the MFF, with pretty much all the extra money earmarked for COVID recovery measures. But again, this has drawn some worried glances from the member states, because when the budget goes up, as any Brussels-based person can tell you, it does not come back down. So this is where we're getting into the member state politics. It would be amiss of me not to mention what the European Central Bank is up to. I'm not an economist, but I would say that on the monetary side, the ECB has been active. Their 750 billion pandemic emergency bond purchase program is a significant bazooka, as they're calling it. And this is alongside their other purchase program, which is another 150 billion. These are very, very significant measures and shows the ECB will fight for the euro. But this opens up the next can of worms, especially as the ECB has probably reached the end of the road in what it can actually do, and some form of debt mutualization is required. And that can of worms is, who pays for this? It will be member states, but which member states? So finally, I would say the crisis has really ripped open old wounds that hadn't been fixed from the sovereign debt crisis. Wealthier states such as the Netherlands, Finland, Germany, Austria, they are now being accused of lacking empathy for the South by not supporting debt mutualization, while southern states, principally Spain and Italy, are being accused of being unrealistic and not expecting terms and conditions to be added to any form of shared debt. So on Tuesday, the Eurozone finance ministers had a 16-hour call that ended in acrimony. They're having another call today. I'm not sure what it'll lead to. There'll probably be a council heads of state meeting next week or the week after. But by all accounts, the meeting followed a familiar format. The Dutch would only agree with strict conditions. The Italians and Spanish wanted debt mutualization. The Germans were very quiet, while the French told everyone else they were doing it wrong. We will see what comes of it. But we do need some form of common strategy, because if that doesn't happen, this will make the sovereign debt crisis of 2007 seem minor. Italy and Spain are not Greece. They are not small countries of 4 million people on the periphery of the European economy. They are at the heart of the Eurozone project, and they will need some form of support. And I hope we can find mechanisms that allow that to happen.
Thanks, Tom. Just want to remind everyone that you can submit your questions anytime, and we'll get to them at the end. So please do, using the chat box. So my first question, and I'm going to go first to you, Tom, is looking at the individual member states and what they've done. Who's gotten it right, and who's had the best economic response, in your opinion? And who do you think has gotten it wrong? And then after Tom is done, Susan, if you want to chime in, please do.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question, because when you say who's done it best, I think there were some predictable reactions, and some countries had tools that they could already lead on. Denmark went early and hard, quite impressively, and the government said, right, we're going to cover 90% of hourly workers' wages and 75% of those salaried workers, like straight out the gate. That's what they said. These measures will be expensive. I think the low end is a 13% addition to, sorry, 13% cost of total GDP. But they have those mechanisms ready to go because they have a very strong, they have a very strong sector when it comes to when people are laid off and things like that. The same with the Kurzarbeit in Germany, is covering up to 65% of laid off workers. But these are mechanisms that are tried and tested. I think if we go to countries that didn't have mechanisms in place already to fall back on, but actually did impressive stuff, Portugal acted really quickly and quite impressively, given how slowly their neighbor in Spain moved. And the UK, as a Brit, has been slightly confusing. I was impressed with the measures when they were introduced, but how they were introduced was probably disappointing from my side. And I would also say Italy has been surprising. They promised to provide some support for workers, but they have a real problem with their black economy, which especially impacts women. I think it's 1 in 4 Italian women work in this shadow economy, either as carers, as healthcare workers, not healthcare workers, sorry, carers of family, as cleaners, those kind of things. So that's a quarter of working women, and they won't be covered under these schemes. And I think because of the speed at which this has happened, these kind of holes have popped up all over the continent because they've had to employ it rapidly. But it's hit Italy quite hard because of the nature of their economy originally. The Denmark, Germany, even Belgium, they have very high percentage of the workforce is trapped and is already in schemes that have a form of coverage.
Great.
Do you want me to comment a little bit?
If you'd like.
Yeah, well, I mean, just to say, I mean, I'm not the economist here, but I think what I would say, and it's great to hear Tom's comments, is I think it's too early to say. I think it's really difficult to judge, especially on the economic measures. I think what is really important to stress is that the absolute focus at the moment are still short-term measures, and it's all to do with tackling the health emergency. So I think we should sort of emphasize that everybody here is in crisis mode. It is primarily the health, and therefore you're seeing different, if we go back to the measures for the health emergency, they come before the economic measures still, with regard to some countries have had partial lockdowns, some have full lockdowns, some introduced them sooner than others. And obviously those measures taken for the health emergency are also having different impacts on the economic effect as well. And as alluded to there, I think what everyone is seeing, and it's a learning game for everyone, is how intricate all the supply chains and value chains are, and have everything interlinks with everything. So you can have an economic measure to protect one sector, but by doing that, you're having another impact on another sector that's interlinked. It's incredible, including, maybe we'll come to that, sort of also the definition of helping essential sectors and essential services. Well, what exactly does that comprise? How do you define, before you start trying to do a measure to help essential services, what exactly is an essential service? Is it simply just medical equipment, or is it the staff needing to cross borders in order to service energy plants to ensure that we still have the electricity to run hospitals and factories? So I'll stop there, but I think it's still too early to say on the economic front of who's got it right.
Yeah, the amount of uncertainty that this virus has put all of us under, I think, is the thing that's really driving the unnerve a lot of us feel. I've been speaking to a bunch of small business owners here in the States, and every single one says they have no clue whether or not their company will survive at the tail end of business and be able to reopen, despite what the U.S. has done in terms of the small business check protection program and other measures. And I'm wondering, how have European businesses reacted? Are they in the same pit of fear as over here, or are the European responses helping them out, helping them plan for the future a little bit better?
I presume that's for me. If I can react on the business front. Thanks for the question. I mean, I think yes. What's interesting, I mean, you've got, we represent the larger businesses, the big businesses. So indeed, there's already, if you think about it, in theory, the bigger businesses are going to be more able and more resilient to cope with this than the smaller businesses. But we know that I think it's 95% of the jobs in Europe are with SMEs. So every big company relies on, has smaller businesses in the supply chain. So huge impact there. I think it also depends sector to sector. So even within the larger businesses, you're seeing absolutely the uncertainty. The automotive industry starting to be decimated. I spoke to someone in the airline industry earlier today. It's absolutely catastrophic for anyone involved in anything to do with the aviation industry. So there again, you have different challenges for the tech industry, where actually that, and I go back to the essential services. What's interesting actually is when you delve deeper, they may not look as though it's not quite as catastrophic for them, but they still have challenges with regard to chips are in medical equipment. So they haven't been assigned to be an essential service at the moment, but the more you delve into it, the more you realize that they are as well. And perhaps another comment is, which is very important for us, is I liaise very closely with heads of other associations in Brussels, so all different sectors. So if you take the retail sector, for example, there you've got massive differences. In the retail, you have the food obviously completely overwhelmed, not always able to get the supplies in, doing very well to a certain extent, but also suffering from problems such as staff shortages. So this is where all the uncertainty, to your point, comes in, is you don't know what the challenges are. Absolute staff shortages, and in some cases, different food retailers competing with others to get staff on salary. And then you have the other half of retail, namely non-food, going into, looking at bankruptcy. So hugely different reactions depending on the sector. And obviously, I would just say, again, pretty much 100% crisis mode everywhere you look.
I want to add a point on there about actual people not being able to find enough workers. And one industry that's kind of slipped under the guard, but is now making a lot more noise and countries are realizing, is the agricultural industry. The agriculture industry in Spain, France, Germany, the UK is critically dependent on the free movement of seasonal laborers. And this isn't happening. And in the UK, you have joking around a seasonal land army calling back to the Second World War. In Germany, they're trying to get school kids and college kids who aren't at school because they're shut. They're potentially trying to mobilize them to actually go into the fields. And it shows you how reliant we were as a continent on open borders. But this crisis has really exposed some industries in a way they weren't expecting. And it is, as you say, it's too early to say.
Yeah. I've seen the the stories about all the asparagus in Germany going to rot because they don't have enough guest workers that they usually have. So I think
I'll jump in on that. I think Tom and I have probably seen the same report, but actually to this seasonal worker issue, it's what will be very interesting on the European side, actually in the UK, and you can hear I'm British as well, although I'm not Belgian too, I'm a true European, is that seasonal workers, they used to be thought that these were the jobs that would not be done by the British. Brexit was already going to cause a bit of a problem there because we relied so much on EU workers. Now there aren't the workers at all. So you'll get maybe now the Brits going and different nationalities realizing they're going to do jobs that they may not have done before because the workers are simply not there. So there could be quite a shift there in the workforce overall.
Yeah. Will it bring wider appreciation of different workers? I know in Luxembourg, their measures, their economic measures, are guaranteeing income of 75% up to a maximum of 250% of the minimum wage. But this has actually caused a huge argument because a lot of these critical workers who have to keep working, your nurses, your bin men, some of your lower level telecoms engineers are earning less than that, and then not being allowed access to this fund. So it's very interesting seeing which workers are being protected and which workers aren't. And it could lead to a reevaluation of who is seen as critical.
Yeah, agree.
Yeah, I think the virus is making us reevaluate a lot of things these days. It'll be interesting to see what changes will stick after the crisis is over. We have a couple of listener questions I want to get to now. One is, do you guys know what the EU's plans are for resuming airline flights within Europe, and then after that between Europe and Asia? You guys have any insight on that?
Well, the Commission was actually meant to put forward its plan or its communication for how we were going to get out of the lockdown. So they were going to basically describe the path to the way out. But this triggered a member state response from across the board because they didn't want the Commission to have this power. My understanding is it's still very much a member state competency. Taking Sweden's example, they've guaranteed credit to airlines or with a majority of their operations or a significant amount of operations in Sweden for as long as the crisis lasts. So airlines there are fine, whereas in the UK, they've gone, well, only step in as a lender of last resort. So in terms of pathways out of this, I think it's too early to say, but there probably won't be a central effort at the moment.
No, and I don't know either, but I think a quite important point is exactly that member states will decide that. I believe in Belgium, it's certainly, I think I read something just today, not till the end of May. I think they're going to extend it to the end of May actually for travel coming from outside in, but don't quote me on that one. But I think the important point I wanted to make here was the risk of every country doing it its own way. So even though the EU, again, doesn't have the competence to decide this, there is a feeling that what's been called the exit strategy that everybody wants needs to be coordinated, because it could cause more chaos and more disruption if one country's opening up much more quickly than another. People are supposedly crossing borders, but they can't. Again, it affects the supply chains. And I think you'll see a definite ask from the business community that the exit strategy is coordinated as far as is possible throughout the EU.
Yeah, the coordination will be key. So talking about the exit strategy, what do you guys think needs to be done so that the European economy can recover quickly once these quarantining measures have ended?
That's a huge question. I think even a recovery at this moment is ambitious. Maybe just stabilization should be the goal. I alluded to it briefly in my talking points, but we need some form of debt mutualization. Otherwise, we'll have another sovereign debt crisis in the south of the continent. But you have a situation where in northern countries, especially the Netherlands, but also Finland, Austria, Germany, the population of these countries are massively against this. And the politicians of these countries are beholden to their people, not to the EU as a whole. So we're going to have to find some ingenious workaround for it. It probably will be some form of mutualization, but it will have enough for northern governments to kind of save face. And then there will need to be significant spending, hopefully coordinated from the European Union. I know in the proposed increased MFF, there's ideas for all kinds of things. So using some of these corona bonds to pay for cross-continent research and innovation. So something that Dutch companies or German companies could actually get money out of, but working in collaboration with investment in Spain, in Portugal, in Italy. I would always advocate for a framework that allows as much cooperation as possible, but it has to be supported by some form of debt support for the South, in my view.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Susan, you want to chime in?
Yeah, well, I can comment in. I won't comment so much on the sort of economic measures. I think I alluded to some in my opening remark, the three, what we're going to ask for with regard to, how the exit strategy and economic recovery, which is, again, I know it sounds like a broken record, but anything to do with the single market needs to be protected and boosted. And certainly what we will be looking at is what was already on the table, and some of the key initiatives that were on the table is something called the Green Deal. So we're debating, well, is this now redundant or not? And some saying, no, it's never been more important. Industrial strategy, and of course, digital strategy. I would say two of the pillars that we will be looking at with regard to helping the EU get out of this and recover as quickly as possible is green strategy and digital. And looking at it from the point of view of, it can't be just looked at how it was before, but with this COVID angle, how is the economy changing? And what needs to be addressed. But certainly, I mean, that's a whole other discussion, but the whole digital agenda will be certainly looked at in a completely different way now, because look at us all. It's shown how essential this absolutely is. But perhaps just a few sort of other points. We're again, I think most people are in the phase of trying to work out, well, what is it? How can we help? What is our input to economic recovery? And I would say, a couple of things that have come up, resilience of global supply chains is going to have to be looked at. Diversification is going to have to be looked at. More investment in infrastructure and innovation, that's key. You mentioned SMEs before, supporting the small and medium-sized enterprise is going to be somewhere top of the list, and looking at recovery benefits for all those who need them. I'll stop there.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned the Green Deal, because we got a question on that specifically, and how the crisis was impacting the effort to move ahead with that policy. And Susan, sounds like you think it's now more than ever a priority. Tom, do you agree with that? Do you think we'll see that be a major focus for the Commission going forward?
Well, I think it will remain the focus of the Commission, but whether the Council and the Member States fall in line is another question. There are green shoots of hope, sorry, in Member States. I think there's 12 of them yesterday wrote a letter saying they felt that the Green Deal should be at the heart of any recovery. Then at the same time, you have Poland is already saying this should be an excuse for them not to have to meet their environmental targets, like they're going to have to double down on saving their economy. Then you have different sectors are asking for different things. The French automotive sector yesterday began, well, for a while, but yesterday began lobbying to not have to meet their targets on selling a certain percentage of low emission vehicles this year. They want it pushed back a year, maybe two, because of the virus. So I think it's too early to say. I also think the Commission and those in power in the Commission vocally seem to be wanting to push the Green Deal forward as the engine for growth. I hope that's the case, but whether it is a more complicated question.
I think I agree. It's too early to say, because one of the discussions I've been in, it was there's a difference of opinion. So I think it depends who's looking at it. I think it's important to stress, perhaps to those of you on the other side of the Atlantic, that the Green Deal is not just about green. It's got a sort of climate change element to it, which is one element. It's also got industrial strategy within it. It's also got something called farm to fork within it, which is the sort of agricultural element. So you could argue that some of these pieces with regard to sustainable food, it's about sustainability, are exactly very relevant to recovery. So, I mean, I'm not an expert on the Green Deal, but I think it's worth seeing it as something. It is much broader than just climate change only. It goes much deeper than that.
Yeah, I mean, the idea of a Green Deal there, and the similar idea being pitched over here, the Green New Deal, is very much one of a huge industrial policy, and really letting the government direct investment in a way that a lot of the more conservative governments and politicians on both sides of the Atlantic are going to be less than supportive of. One question I had going into this is the question of whether or not this crisis is going to be the straw that breaks the camel's back for Europe. The European Union as a concept walked into this already under incredible stress. Tom mentioned the Euro crisis. We just had Brexit. We're seeing really extreme nationalist parties gain popularity across the continent, and in particular, what has happened in Hungary really, I think, puts a strain on the idea of the European Union, the ideals that it has about protecting liberal democracy in the classical sense. My question is, what do you think is going to happen? Is this going to break the European Union further apart, or will the EU be able to unite against this adversity in an effort to defeat coronavirus?
That is a. Oh, sorry, Susan.
No, go for it, Tom. Go for it.
No, I was just going to say that is a huge question, but it's also one that pretty much most EU study students would answer with, well, Europe was made through crisis. There is some truth to that. I think as well, one thing I would drill down on when you say Europe was already going to the extremes, we've seen some interesting things happen in the polls in the last few weeks, with the extremes actually dying back. Salvini the nationalist leader opposition leader in Italy, his support has collapsed. And Conte has had his highest levels of approval because people in a crisis, and I'm sure you can appreciate this across the pond in the US, you kind of want a reasonable leader during a crisis. You want someone talking practically, listening to the science and getting stuff done. Similar collapses have been seen in Spain with Vox. Their polling is halved by some measures. And even in France, Marine Le Pen's support is not as strong as it was. So politically, it might bring people back to the center, or it could be short term. So that's one point I just wanted to make.
Yeah, I agree. It's really interesting, Tom. Exactly, that's happened. In that, in spite of what you're hearing, and actually that figure that you quoted at the beginning about the sentiment in Italy, there has been to a certain extent, this pullback and support for the leaders, including, I think, Boris Johnson in the UK has gone right up in the ratings again. People need leadership. So that's a very interesting, and we do need leadership. This is it. That's why my call for was in my opening remarks. You do need leadership in crises. At the same time, the point I would like to make is that indeed this is a topic that's been raised this week amongst our membership, which is really quite worrying. That I think every time you open the press, and depending on what you're reading over there, there seems to be a negative narrative, doom and gloom about the EU. Indeed, I totally agree that the sentiment in Italy is, I can't judge on whether it's right or wrong, but it is poor, but therefore there's an assumption that the EU is going to fall apart. And if you do talk, and we raised this with our members, and several of them came out this week and said that the EU has actually reacted quickly. It's come out within the competences, which Tom explained at the beginning, within what it has the remit to do. It has reacted quite quickly and brought out measures pretty swiftly. And this is part of the problem with Europe over here, is the storytelling. We had this before the referendum. The storytelling about Europe is not a good one. It needs to change. I'm passionate about that. It tends to be always one thing in the Brussels bubble, and then political leaders go back to their countries, and then there's a sort of much more negative story again. But this isn't helping. So I haven't answered your question yet. I think some education needs to be done. It's so complicated, including in Brussels, about, well, what is the EU actually responsible for? You know, can it make decisions on healthcare or not? No, actually, healthcare is not one of its competencies, so it can't suddenly come up with a solution. It has to be really careful. Is it the straw that breaks the camel's back? I think if we need to pull together, which is why our messaging is for solidarity and speaking out for the European project. And actually, all the associations I spoke to this morning agreed and said, no, there is support for the European project, but it has to come out in a much more positive way. Yeah. So I would certainly hope not. It would not be good globally either. And I think actually, while I have the opportunity to speak to those of you on the other side of the Atlantic, I think it's really important that those on the other side of the Atlantic understand how much US companies benefit from Europe being cohesive and unified. This is not a game. There's a huge, the economies are so intertwined that it also benefits us to have leadership on both sides of the Atlantic that speak out positively about Europe as well, which does not always happen. And I would encourage you all to think about it in that way and see Europe as a strong economic partner and a friend, and that will help everybody.
I think one comment I would like to add at the end of Susan's point, and one that I agree with you entirely, it's a storytelling problem. When Russia puts masks on a plane saying, "From Russia with love," or I think that's a James Bond film, but that's what they said. And then the Chinese are there shaking hands and doctoring social media videos, so it shows Italians chanting "They love China," when the reality is thank you to their own medics. But they're good at this storytelling. They show that image. When the EU orchestrates patients leaving Paris for Luxembourg so they can get help, or helps Italian patients leave for Germany, it doesn't communicate it very well, or member states take the credit. So it really needs to double down on this messaging of what it is actually doing. I mean, there have been mistakes, don't get me wrong, but I think a lot of the sentiment from that earlier poll by the Italians isn't really directed at the institutions. It's directed at the lack of power within the institutions, or the lack of solidarity among the member states.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's a tricky one to fix, though, because if you say the EU's failing and the solution is to give the EU more power vis-a-vis the member states, that's a hard sell for the average Italian or the average Spaniard or the average German, for that matter, to the stomach. I've always been amazed at how complex the messaging around the European experiment there has been for that reason. So we have a couple more listener questions here. Please keep them coming, guys. We have, I think, about 10 more minutes left on this. So one question is, what's a collective message that we, the listeners, can send to the business community globally to encourage hope and optimism during this time? Susan, you want to take a step?
Yeah. So, what a message to send to the business community, or that the business community can send?
Yeah. What would you say, or what are you saying to your community right now to keep people from, frankly, giving into a pretty, I think, understandable amount of despair right now?
I would say, and this is my actual feeling, in fact, there has never been so much sense of solidarity and community, in spite of what the conversation we've just had. I think in most, whether it's between colleagues, between organizations, I mean, I talk about my AmCham's network. This is with 45 countries, Europe and Eurasia. Never before have we spoken to each other so often, and never before have we been able to come out with a statement within 4 days signed up by 45 countries calling for solidarity, coordination and action with regard to this crisis. So for me, there is hope. This may be simple, but we did it in 3 days. There was no question. It is really something where This is a global problem. We have to stand together, and I've seen enough positive stories to feel that there is hope, and it is positive because so many of us are already doing that. So the message for that listener to give is to say, yes, if we stand together and we work together to find common solutions and global solutions, we can get through this. And it is already happening. It is already happening. I'd also say, don't believe everything you read in the press. Exactly to Tom's point, there is a load of fake news out there. So some of the fake news that was out there, we didn't know if it was fake about, is American cash being handed out on airport runways in Europe or not? We've discussed that with our US friends. We've discussed it with European friends. The majority say this is fake news. There's no proof of that. So just be careful what you read and work together, and we can do it.
Great. Another question. There have been some talk of waves after the lockdown, meaning once the lockdown measures are lifted, people are going to get sick again, and the cycle might repeat itself. To what extent can the economy deal with that? I actually want to jump in and respond to that to begin with. Every economist I have spoken to here in the US, and I've spoken to, I think, a dozen in the past week, every single one has said the number one thing for the economy is getting a hold, control over this virus. The sooner we can stop the spread, the sooner the health response can get rapid testing deployed across communities, and the sooner you can get serological tests to see who has already gotten the virus and now has developed an immunity to it, the sooner you can reopen. When you look at some of the other countries that have done a really good job responding, like South Korea and Hong Kong. It's everyone using masks and everyone having tests when they need them. And because of that, they haven't shut down their economy in the same way that America has and a lot of European countries have. I was wondering if Tom, Susan, either of you want to jump in on that.
Well, I think we're already seeing some European countries planning for a staggered release of the handbrake, so a staggered return to normality. Belgium's planned 4 stages, and they have 125 categories before that have to be ticked before we can move into each stage. And some of that presumes the virus is coming back with waves. Similar, although I don't know the exact regulations in Germany and Austria, but there are similar structures there. And the goal is essentially they know the virus will come back, but they want to rapidly increase testing. Once this bubble is under control, they can take the handbrake off a bit and let more and more people go back to work in the economy while protecting the most vulnerable and only letting those people out at the end, or letting more people out when the capacity to test has increased. So I think they're building into their plans the fact this virus will come back, but the goal is to have more concrete testing and targeted protection of vulnerable populations.
All right, we got another question here. Will this crisis force broader adoption of innovative learning modalities in Europe? How might that change the dynamic with US-based education providers and servicers? And there's a clarification question is focused more on post-secondary education. You guys have any insight?
Okay, this is actually a really, really interesting question. And it's something I have a colleague who could answer it brilliantly because that's their portfolio. So if they want to direct me an email, I can get them an answer. But from the top of my head, I know that governments are looking to facilitate more online learning. I don't know how that relates to tertiary education because we've only been focusing on primary and secondary. Well, I have, but I can ask my colleague to answer that question.
All right. Please do reach out to Tom and he'll hook you up on that. Got another question, and let's try to keep this moving quick as we're running out of time. Can the speakers talk a little bit more about EU country policies towards the SMEs? On the more general level, does CQ or AmCham Europe have any reports which compiles specific nation-level economic policies against the pandemic? And if you guys do, I don't know if FiscalNote does. I know CQ Roll Call does not right now. But if you guys do, please share.
Yeah. So,
Okay.
sorry.
No, you go for it, and then I'll go after you.
We have a FiscalNote. We're compiling a database of this information, and we're close to releasing it. I think there's just a couple of details left behind.
Yeah, all I was going to say was it's one of these. It's very difficult. We made an attempt within the network to compile, government measures that were taking place in all the member states. The problem is they're changing on a sort of daily basis. So I think indeed probably FiscalNote and some of the big consultancies like PwC, EY, a lot of them have these trackers up. The only thing I can suggest as far as we're concerned, do take a look at our COVID portal on the AmCham website, and we have some links to useful resources of those who are already doing trackers. So you can try those. If you've got a specific country in mind, I would recommend that you go directly to that country's government website, and/or in our case, you can certainly try that local AmCham for help.
Yeah, that's very useful. So we're just about out of time. Why don't I ask one final question? So one of the things that when I've talked to friends of mine in Germany, and they describe a feeling of sort of resentment towards some of the southern countries for essentially, it's like Aesop's fable, right? Where Germany's the ant and Italy's the grasshopper, or Greece is the grasshopper. Do you think more like if some of the southern countries could adopt some of the automatic stabilizers like the Kurzarbeit program, or adopted a little bit more fiscal austerity, even though most economists, I think, say that there's no need for it, that might help bridge the divide and the north-south divide on how to respond to debt mutualization or some of these other issues that are driving the EU apart.
I think the problem you would have is if you try to force any measures on the southern economies, they would point to the fact that after the last sovereign debt crisis, they had a decade of little to no growth and the stripping back of their social contracts. So they would probably not want, people would not let their governments sign up to those measures again. I know there's a French proposal, which is kind of a middle ground. The details of it. So essentially you would have, there'd be a staggered way out of it. So you'd have a temporary framework in place, which with some conditionality, but the assumption is that the economies would then grow. So it's similar to the ESM, but it'd be a pooling of funds with limits. Yeah, I think the problem you've highlighted that this German resentment of, or potential German resentment or Dutch resentment of perceived southern inability to reform their systems, it doesn't reflect the reality that German and Dutch economies have done very, very, very well out of the euro. And Italy and Spain, amongst others, have been the anchor that stopped the euro overvaluing itself. So they need these countries in. And if you look at Italian productivity measures, if you look at their actual employment rates, they are working hard. The people there are working hard. It's the myth of the lazy southerner. I think it is a damaging one, in my view.
Yeah, I think.
Can I just comment there? Just
yes, please.
Not as an economist, I hasten to add, but I think it's important to remember that everyone benefits from being in this EU, and I think it's important to remember there are cultural differences as well between North and South, and it's not quite that easy to say, oh yeah, the southern countries should do this, the southern countries, again, the northern countries should do that. There have been other moments where actually the Germans have been encouraged to spend some more, and they save so much, and they need to spend to fire the fire the economy, and they haven't done that. So, there's criticism all round, but I would agree with Tom that I think the principle here is that everyone is benefiting some way, and just remember some of these differences. And again, there might be resentments, but we've got to overcome those. People have got to stick together and think more broadly and be more solidaire.
Yeah, I think perhaps the biggest challenge facing Europe isn't some economic policy or monetary issue, but the challenge of that Europe doesn't have a shared national identity in a way the United States of America does. We don't think of ourselves as Pennsylvanians and New Yorkers first. We think of ourselves as Americans first. It wasn't always that way. And that's a huge problem, but that's something we'll have to debate some other time because unfortunately we're out of time for today. I'd like to thank Susan and Tom for taking the time to participate, and I'd like to thank our listeners for joining us. We know your time is valuable, and we appreciate you spending it with us. As a follow-up, we'll be sending out the recording of today's webinar. And if you'd like to learn more about how FiscalNote can help your organization monitor the politics and policy around COVID-19, please visit coronavirus.fiscalnote.com. Also, remember to sign up for our complimentary access to the EU policy updates on COVID-19 at fnlink.co/EU-dossiers. Have a great rest of the day, everyone. Thank you.